Hello everybody and welcome to our talk on global crisis and power dynamics and the breakdown of US hegemony. Just to start off, like everyone knows who Donald Trump is, right? Yeah. All right. But like, does any of you know why he does anything that he does? I mean, there are a number of competing theories, obviously. Maybe he's evil, like devil incarnate. If you ask a Democrat, that's probably the answer you get. Or maybe he's just crazy or whatever. Today's speaker, Stavros Mavroudeas of Panteion University from Greece, will have an alternate explanation for us. He is a professor of political economy, hailing from the Marxist tradition, and he is going to give us his sort of explanation and framework for why the things in the world and the things with the US in particular are going the way that they are. So, here you go.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak to young people that are trying to grasp, with Marxism especially, under difficult situations and in difficult times. Now, let me proceed directly to the subject of my talk. You can see the title, Deglobalization, Multipolarity, and the Return of the Theory of Imperialism. Actually, the whole talk is organized around two basic axes. The first axis is covers the theoretical discourse, meaning with what theory can we understand the international political economy in the era of capitalism, of course. And then how we can apply this theory, and especially the one that I'm proposing, meaning the classical Marxist theory of imperialism, in the current situation. And the main characteristic of the current situation is the abrupt change of the political and economic policy of the world capitalist superpower, the US, under the second Trump administration. So, two things. First, a discussion of the theories around the international political economy, and second, on the basis of the Marxist theory of imperialism, how we can understand what's happening nowadays in the world, and especially the policies of the US imperialism under the Trump administration. Okay, let me proceed directly to the subject. Till almost 2 years ago, if someone had a look at the theoretical discourse regarding international economics or international political economy, whatever you looked at, there was one concept that dominated the whole spectrum: globalization. So you could, this term, globalization, with different meanings, and seldom and very weak definitions, dominated the whole spectrum of analysis. Not only the mainstream economics, but also dominated also heterodox economics, and to a great extent Marxist political economy. I will argue that this was an erroneous thesis, a wrong theory, both in its mainstream version, but also in its heterodox and radical and also Marxist variants. And a different theory, the Marxist theory of imperialism, is a more coherent and more realistic theory in order to understand how the international system of capitalism functions, operates. So, The first part of my talk would be around the so-called globalization and nowadays the globalization riddle. First point, for almost 30 years, the globalization thesis was considered as an undisputed fact. How can we define it? There are many definitions. A broad definition of globalization is that there is a unified world economy and national economies have become irrelevant. So a corollary of this is that national economic policies are irrelevant. You can't do anything, even if you want. Why? Because the economy has been globalized. So it's beyond the reach and the control of national governments. Of course, that was a very useful trick for many national governments in order to implement reactionary and austerity policies and saying, it's not our fault. We are obliged because of the global environment, because of globalization. On the basis of this argument, the globalization thesis, which was considered as an undisputed fact, it's a fact there, you can't dispute it. Although I'll try to argue that it was a quite disputable fact. On the basis of this, economic policies were formulated, especially at the international level, and there we have two main things. You might have heard about them, the so-called Washington consensus politics, and then a bit afterwards, the post-Washington consensus theories. Let me very briefly, and if it is necessary, I can explain it more in Q&A, in questions. The Washington consensus, both the Washington and the post-Washington consensus took their names, from what? From the big international institutions that are established in Washington. Two of them, IMF and the World Bank, with their division of labor that they have between them. So the policies of these two big international economic institutions followed the idea, the thesis of globalization. They were first codified in the Washington consensus, and the Washington consensus by its own proponent, Williamson, was what? Exactly, almost verbatim in his words. It was a version of mild neoliberalism, meaning, this usually happens, meaning what? Meaning a refined, more realistic and less dogmatic version of neoliberal policies for the international economy, with special emphasis on what less developed and developed economies should do. And the crux of this policy was liberalize. Open your economies. Okay. So it was a mild, realistic version of neoliberalism. This mild and less dogmatic version started having problems at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the the beginning of the 21st century. So a new formula was devised, and this new formula was the post-Washington consensus. Now, the post-Washington consensus is not a neoliberal consensus. It's a new Keynesian consensus, because in my humble opinion, neoliberalism has ceased to be the dominant economic paradigm in the West, at least since the global crisis of 2008. There is a successor, equally conservative, which is New Keynesianism. New Keynesianism is usually characterized, main representatives, Paul Krugman, with some peculiarities, Joseph Stiglitz, and many others. Now, New Keynesianism has been characterized as Keynesianism in the short run and neoliberal in the long run. And more or less let us stick with this description, although the picture is more complicated. What's the main difference of the post-Washington consensus, meaning the international reshape under New Keynesianism? Increased state economic intervention, which of course it's an anathema for neoliberalism. So there is a very bold difference between them, and of course common elements. But the main difference is that for the post-Washington consensus, a New Keynesianism, state economic interventionism in the short run works, is efficient, which is an anathema. Neoliberalism cannot accept for that. For neoliberalism, state economic interventionism is inefficient both in the short run and in the long run. Okay. So, the post-Washington consensus was a reshape for the international economy, always in terms of globalization, but under a different political economic paradigm from neoliberalism, under the guidance of New Keynesianism. Now, let me skip the rest. You can have the PowerPoint and possibly get questions, and I'll be happy to reply. Just one point on this slide. What I have tried to argue till now is the following. From the mid-1980s till the beginning of the 21st century, and especially till the eruption of the 2008 global crisis, the globalization thesis was suffocatingly dominating the scientific intellectual scene. Not only in mainstream economics, in heterodox economics, and even to a certain extent in Marxist economics. Things suddenly change, and they change after the 2008 crisis, and suddenly you can see, for example, look at the Davos Forum, the previous, not the last one. They suddenly discovered that we have deglobalization. Why? For very superficial reasons. That's the way that the mainstream in economics and not only works, very superficially. It adheres dogmatically to an idea, and suddenly when this idea does not fit to reality, it abruptly changes to a different one. What was the change? The changes of policy of the US. Under the first Trump administration, under Biden as well, as I'll try to explain, and of course with the second Trump administration. So suddenly there was an abrupt change. We had to go globalization. We considered that globalization was the name of the game from here till the end of the world. And suddenly we discovered that globalization is crumbling. And there was an oscillation in the middle. For example, in previous Davos forums, and not only, the literature is full of this, saying, okay, globalization is not crumbling, but it is changing. It will have different forms and things like this. Nowadays, everybody talks about deglobalization. And especially people that were vociferous adherents of the argument, globalization is here to stay. This is a very superficial and unscientific, I would call it, way to understand and analyze and treat things. You can't just change the side of your jacket like this. So, what I'll try to argue is that that's the second bullet from the end, that the international capitalist economy, or the world economy that is dominated by capitalism, if we accept that there might be economies that are of a different kind, passes, as we know, from periods of increased internationalization of capital to periods of decreasing internationalization of capital. An even superficial knowledge of economic history, of the world economy, shows this, and I'll try to explain it. So, if there is this wave-like movement from periods of so-called increased globalization, or better, increased internationalization of capital, to periods of decreased internationalization of capital, how can we understand them? If we go beyond a myopic view, it is either the one, it is the other. We know that both exist, and we move from the one phase to the other. What theory can explain it? Mainstream economics have failed utterly in doing this. So that's what I'll try to do. Let me very briefly survey the globalization thesis, how it appeared. It appeared during the late 20th century, around 1980, 1985. The main argument was that there is a radical break in the way that the world economy operates, and this happened at the second half of the 1980s. And what was that radical break? The forces of the economy, in the mainstream view, the market forces, broke out the national economic straitjackets and expanded to the whole world. There was, of course, a hidden element there. What? The 1989 collapse of the Eastern Bloc, and together with that, the collapse of the so-called Third World, or the independence movement, meaning developing economies that try to oscillate and hedge the course between the Western and the Eastern Bloc. After 1989, everything came under the power of the West. So that was the background of this argument about globalization. You might have had the talk that Carney is the current Canadian Prime Minister, voiced in Davos. It was very, not exactly honest, very accurate, because Carney was a central banker. He took part in the previous situation. He's not an innocent bystander, okay? But the whole discourse, the whole talk, was very accurate. Globalization, it was not actually never a globalization, a rules-based order. Always those at the top, meaning the West, did their thing. And whenever the rules didn't suit them, they were able to bypass them. But this has ended. That's the message. That was the message by Carney. It's very interesting. Now, what was the globalization thesis? The first definition was that at the end of the 1980s, there was a radical break. The market forces broke out the national boundaries. They were organized in global circuits of production and exchange. So national economies and national economic policies become irrelevant. There were different theories regarding how this happened. One was a very stupid, myopic technological explanation, meaning information technologies provided the technological ground for this radical break, very superficial view, for several reasons. The second was a bit more robust, political reasons, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the vacuum that was created. The third that predominated, especially within radical heterodox and Marxist economics, was a rather superficial view that there is an inherent tendency of capitalist accumulation to become globalized. Very myopic, as I'll try to argue. The two necessary corollaries, you can see them at the end. I've spoken about them, so I'll skip them. I'll skip the political arguments, just to mention two things. The economic arguments went hand in hand with two political arguments. The one that globalization would usher a spread of global democracy. This actually never happened. And also that it would get rid of wars. Why? Because of the simplistic, liberal argument that capital abhors war. Business do not like wars. Business want a stable environment to make profits, and where wars disrupt this environment. This is a very stupid idea. It's the idea of classical liberalism of the 18th century, and was destroyed both by the increased war incidents at the end of the 18th century, in the 19th century, and of course by the two world wars. And we know very well that capital can make a huge profits during wars. So let me try to summarize this. The globalization thesis rested upon two main empirical arguments. First, that globalization constitutes an unforeseen before epochal change, and second, that it is irreversible. It's the name of the game from here and onwards. Now, the first argument was disputed very early, and actually the globalizationists had to concede defeat on this. Why? Because we know very well that during from the mid of the 19th century, there was a so-called first globalization, at least in terms of economic indices and also of political indices. And this collapsed. So the argument that globalization is something that has never happened very easily went away. And the globalizations, the proponents of globalization theory were obliged to concede defeat. Why? Because we know very well that there was a so-called first globalization, and this first globalization collapsed. Now, I'll skip the rest. The second argument, that it was a second line defense. Okay, it happened before, it collapsed, but this time is different. And this time it will survive. Now, this is a very weak argument. It was proposed in the 1990s. And it was also, it couldn't also stand to empirical scrutiny. The empirical arguments that they said, for example, the role of the internationalization of the financial sector, or of the production circuits, international production chains and things like this. If someone looked at the indices and the numbers, during the first globalization, we have pretty similar trends and things. So There was nothing spectacular nowadays different from that period. So the empirical claims were, of the globalization argument were problematic from the very beginning. What are the analytical foundations of the globalization theory? The theory behind globalization. I'll focus mainly on the mainstream thing. Mainstream economics and mainstream international economics, both neoclassical and Keynesian, with some oscillations by the Keynesians, but they almost share the same theory. This theory is based on what? On the dogma of the beneficial role of free trade. Free trade is the basis on which international economics were created. Why? Because trade, international trade, was the first economic activity that surpassed national borders, national boundaries. So the whole theory of international economics was based on the theory of international trade. What's the main argument there? Free trade is beneficial to all. What's the basis of this argument? We know it very well. It's a thesis proposed by David Ricardo, the theory of comparative cost or comparative advantage. And then Ricardo proposed this thesis in value theory terms. And then this was reformulated, but the main idea is the same, by Hexer-Ollin and Samuelson. What's the main idea behind that? It's the following. If we have two countries, an international economy with two countries, A and B, and the economy A is a developed one, and the economy B is a less developed one, and we have also two internationally tradable goods, 1 and 2. The developed economy might be more productive in producing both good one and good two. Why? Because more developed. So it's more competitive. But Ricardo argued the developed economy, economy A, would refrain from producing both goods, and it will focus only on the one, let us say good one, but it is more efficient than in good two. So it will leave to the economy B, the less developed one, the freedom to produce the second good, the good two. Then they will exchange and there will be equilibrium. And that would be mutually beneficial. The whole economy, the global economy, the world economy would be better off. And also there would not be an unfair advantage on behalf of the economy A versus the economy B. Now, we know that this thesis is very problematic, and we know that from the very beginning there was a counter-argument, and the counter-argument was the theory of absolute cost or absolute advantage. It was proposed by Adam Smith in the beginning and refined and reiterated by Karl Marx. And what argued this theory? Exactly opposite from what the Ricardian and the Samuelson and Hexer-Ollin theory argues, meaning that if the developed economy, economy A, is more efficient and productive, both good one and good two, it will do it. This means what? The less developed economy, economy B, would in the long run be bankrupt, because she would be obliged to buy goods from the economy A without gaining something from the other economy. So the economy B should make constant transfers of value to the other economy. if you lose value, economic wealth to economy, then in the end, at some point of time, you will get bankrupt. What's the main difference between these approaches? The first one, the theory of comparative advantage, argues for a paradise, an international economy, mutually beneficial for everyone. The second approach argues for something completely different. The international economy is a battlefield, and the battlefield has winners and losers, and that's the name of the game. Now, in this slide explains what I just argued in the context of two economies with two internationally tradable commodities. I'll skip this. Let me just make a few remarks. I said before that the theory of comparative advantage was proposed by Ricardo, but it was proposed in terms of labor value theory. When the neoclassicals adopted this theory, and the Keynesians, of course, together with the neoclassicals, what they did, of course, they had to throw away the labor theory value and redefine the theory of comparative advantage in terms of prices, first. And second, because they had to add in this theory not only international trade, but also portfolio investment, meaning international investment in terms of stock exchange and international loans, and also FDIs, foreign direct investment. So that was the modification they made, that Hector Rollin and Samuelson made to the Ricardian argument. Now, this modification, the problem, of course, at least in the eyes of Ricardo, because Ricardo was fully aware that the theory of comparative advantage will not hold if capital is mobile. Because in that case, specialization will be determined by absolute and not relative cost. So the mainstream economics, neoclassical and Keynesian, took Ricardo's thesis, expanded it, threw away the labor theory value, and also throw away Ricardo's reservations regarding the applicability of this thesis if there is international capital mobility. There is another important consequence of this theory. It's the last point you can see here. It is the argument proposed by Solow in the classical, neoclassical growth model. It is a corollary, a consequence of the theory of comparative advantage, which says what? That if we have an international economy with two countries, A, B, and B again, A developed, B less developed, the less developed economy would exhibit, for some reasons, a bigger growth rate, whereas the developed economy would have a slower growth rate. So it's like two cars, the one running ahead and the other running behind, but the second one is running faster, whereas the one that's running ahead would reduce speed. Then the result would be what? The developed economy would slow down, the less developed economy will catch up, but in the end, they will land in the running side by side. This is a very problematic mainstream thesis. It's the so-called convergence thesis. We know that it's empirically totally irrelevant, because always we have differences of development in economies. We have the case of the developed economy falling back and the less developed going forward, but never a situation that all the economies are at the same level. Now, I'll skip this, but you can see them in the PowerPoint, about the versions of convergence, absolute convergence, conditional convergence, and clump convergence. And let me move to Marxism. Marxism rejects all this. The main idea of Marxism and Marxist political economy is that under capitalism, it is uneven development that reigns. Meaning, always you would always have differences in development level. And of course, differences in growth rates of economies. Why? Because Marx's theory argues that the inherent logic of capitalism systematically produces and perpetuates inequalities between nations and regions. I won't expand on that but you can ask if you want more on that issue. So in empirical terms, and this is the last bullet you can see there, the uneven development thesis fits the empirical data perfectly well, as opposed to the convergence, the mainstream convergence thesis. I'll skip this. Let me move to a more hard issue. How can we codify, taxonomize, the way different schools of economic thought approach the international economy? What I propose is a three-side codification. The first is orthodoxy. The orthodoxy means mainly neoclassical and traditional Keynesian. They share the same thesis. All this, especially modern, think that Keynesianism is something different. No, Keynesian is the same breed with the neoclassical. It is, let me say this, they believe to the same religion, but they have their internal differences. They are both Christians, but the neoclassicals are Orthodox and the Keynesians are Catholics. That's the difference. But they are both Christians. The main belief is that international economic relations are inherently mutually beneficial. For neoclassicals, almost instantly, by definition. For Keynesians, no, there can be problems, but if we have state intervention, then the thing would function properly. So the main difference is not the mutual beneficiality of international economic relations, but if this is being achieved instantaneously, automatically by the system itself, or if it requires some help by the state. That's the difference. But the core belief is the same. Then there is the heterodoxy. Heterodoxy is a very diverse cohort of theories in economics. It comprises of post-Keynesian theories of international economy, international trade. These usually add an emphasis on monopolies and monopolization. There is also the so-called radical political economy. The radical political economy are theories and schools of thought that are hybrids between some form of radical Keynesianism and some form of diluted Marxism, I would say. There are several such schools, especially in the 1970s and 80s, existing till today. These theories, the common ground, they have many differences among them, but their common ground is the following. They argue that there is no beneficiality in the mid-term because of policy deformations, because economies and countries do not act properly. So this requires regulation by the state, even some forms of mild protectionism, but mild protectionism, and then somehow the problems of the international capital system would be rectified or at least become less grave, less acute. And then there is Marxism. Marxism has a completely different viewpoint from the previous one, arguing that in a world economy dominated by capitalism, this would be inherently conflictual and not mutually beneficial. I'll skip this thing about orthodoxy and heterodoxy, and I'll move directly to what is, in my opinion, is the best approach to capitalism's international system, and in my opinion, this is the Marxist theory of imperialism. Let me say a word before proceeding. The Marxist theory of imperialism, its nucleus of analysis, is the national economy. This, why, for several reasons, I can explain it if asked, because capitalism is being born, is being created as a national economy. That's the history of capitalism. Unless you go to some rather perverse theories, a world system analysis, for example, we know that in historical reality, capitalism was born as a national economy. The British case is the obvious example. So the fundamental nucleus of the system is always the national economy. Even in periods of increased internationalization of capital. So by definition, the Marxist theory of imperialism does not accept the globalization thesis. Now, how this theory was born, was created. We know that the theory of imperialism was not a Marxist invention. It was, the first proponent was Hobson. Hobson was a Fabian, meaning a Fabian society, if you know. Fabians were reformers of capitalism, some form of conservative social democracy, we could call it in modern terms. So Hobson's thesis was what? There is a deformation of capitalism because some economies have more power, Britain, and for this reason, because they have internal crisis, for Hobson under consumption crisis, lack of effective demand, then they try to export their problems to other economies. And this way, they falsify the free international trade, free international movement of capital, and so on. And how can this be solved? If there is trade unionism in the developed economies, thus oblige capital to increase wages and thus increase demand, and also if there is expansion of democracy, because at that period of time, democracy was, democratic institutions were oligarchic. Okay, you didn't have, the majority of the population didn't have the voting rights. So the first one that proposed the term was Hobson, we know this. And the main idea of Hobson was that imperialism is a deformation of capitalism, and it could be rectified if we had trade unionism and universal suffrage, expansion of democratic rights. Now, the Marxism adopted but also changed this understanding when it adopted it in the beginning of the 20th century. The beginning of the 20th century was a very turbulent period in the sense that it came after the first global capitalism, crisis of capitalism, the crisis of 1873-75. The crisis of 1873-75 actually destroyed classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, both as a philosophical term, also as a political theory, but also as an economic theory, argued that free trade, free capital movements is the solution to the problems. After the crisis, what the 1873 crisis, what we had protectionism, military interventions, forceful political and economic policies, the power of the policies of the powerful upon the less powerful. So at that period of time is that Marxism takes the term imperialism, but transforms it completely. So we have the so-called first phase of this discussion on imperialism. It is usually called in the literature the classical Marxist debate on imperialism. There we had three currents. The one was by Rudolf Hilferding, a very interesting but also very problematic view. The second one was the view proposed by Rosa Luxemburg, theory very close in a sense to some points to Hobson because it's an anti-consumptionist theory. And then we had the view of Lenin, was more sophisticated, had its own problems, but also dominated in the end the whole debate. I'll skip this about Luxemburg. I'll focus a bit on Lenin and especially Bukharin for several reasons, because the main book at that period was written by Bukharin under the supervision, of course, of the old man, meaning Lenin. The main merits of this view were the following. First, it proposed a periodization theory. Now, periodization theory is a very versatile, useful theory in Marxist analysis, almost totally missing from mainstream economics. And its main argument is the following. The evolution of capitalism is not a straight line, but it goes, okay, it's capitalism, but it goes through phases or stages which exhibit qualitative changes. And this argument is very realistic. So that's one merit of this view. The second is the argument about the uneven development thesis against the new classicals, the new classical convergence thesis, but also against Hilferding's similar thesis. In Hilferding, there is something similar to the new classical convergence thesis. Third, that okay, there were oscillations in Lenin regarding underconsumptionism, but in the end, he focuses on the trend of the profit rate. The profit rate, which is the main Marxist economic variable in understanding the evolution of capitalism, is the guiding principle, not only for a national economy, but also for the international economy. And there are also problems with the notion of monopoly for a long period. Lenin accepted the view of Hilferding that there is a trend towards monopolization. So in the end, competition would be extinguished. In the end of his writings, there are more sophisticated versions. There is a very accurate dictum saying that monopoly is the tip of the iceberg, and what lies behind is competition. So monopoly is created out of competition, and it collapses within competition as well. Now, this is what in contemporary Marxist political economic analysis we call real competition. Real competition meaning the opposite of the mainstream perfect competition. There is no such thing as perfect competition. There is a real competition as a battlefield. And in this real competition, there are segments. The main mechanism is competition, but also there are segments where you have oligopolies and monopolies. Now, there was another very interesting argument by Bukharin. Bukharin proposed that in capitalism there is an inherent and permanent contradiction between nationalization and internationalization, meaning that you have periods when the capital accumulation breaks out of national borders, and then this is followed by another period when it returns to its national borders. And this is a very opposite empirical argument. Henry Grossman was a special case, very interesting. I'll skip it for the moment. Now, the logic of the classical Marxist debate was, I think I'm encroaching the time, right? So I'll try to move forward. It was the following. You have problems in capitalist accumulation, meaning crises, especially in the developed economies. These are being tried to be solved by exports of capital, and this leads to imperialist conflicts and rivalries all over the world. So the logic of the classical Marxist theory of imperialism was you have conflicts between developed capitalist economies. Now, in the second phase of this debate, the second phase was dominated by the so-called dependency theory, an interesting but very problematic, in my view, theory. This changed the geometry of the argument. It said all the developed economies are together, the conflicts are non-existent or do not have any significance, and so the developed economies exploit the less developed. That was a very problematic, in my view, thesis. I'll skip what happened. The more interesting contribution on this dependency theory is by Ergiri Emanuel, a Greek economist. His theory of unequal exchange. If you want, I can explain more on this. And the third version was a globalizationist argument that was very vibrant within Marxism. Typical examples, Hard and Negri, which argue that imperialism is out of the picture. It's a wrong theory, doesn't matter. We have a unified world, and in this unified world, even classes have collapsed. You have the multitude, and then you have capital and all these things. Now, I'll skip this and move to the fourth phase. Since the beginning of the 21st century, we have a return of the theory of imperialism. Why? Because the argument of globalization was thrown out. Almost its adherents do not support it nowadays. So the emphasis on the national economy or the blocks of national economies. But in both cases, a conflictual world, a conflictual world economy, a battlefield is the name of the day, the name of the game. So the theory of imperialism is by definition applicable to this. So there was a necessary return of the theory of imperialism. However, there were problems. One is the theory of new imperialism by David Harvey, a very problematic theory, as most of the theories and analysis of David Harvey, apart from his regional economics. Harvey has a very superficial view. He understands imperialism as extractivism, as theft. A dominant economy goes to a less dominant one and simply robs it from resources. This is pre-capitalist imperialism. is imperialism of the Roman Empire or the Spanish Empire. It's not capitalism. In capitalism, as I'll try to argue, imperialism works differently. There might be extractivism, but this is not the main mechanism. In the international transfers of value are the main mechanism. And let me proceed, close the theoretical thing, and possibly how, I think I'm over my time. Okay, I'll try to shorten it. So, in my opinion, imperialism is primarily an economic mechanism and not a political mechanism, meaning that you have imperialism even if you do not have a war and military intervention. Second, imperialism is not a particular stage of capitalism, although it flourishes in some. So imperialism existed from the very beginning of the capitalist system. And imperialism is primarily an economic exploitation mechanism. For Marxism, if there is exploitation within a national economy. What exploitation? Of labor by capital. And then it mirrors this exploitation with an exploitation at an international level, meaning exploitation of some economies from other economies. And these mechanisms of exploitation mingle. So you have at the national level exploitation of labor by capital, and this exploitation also is transposed in exploitation of some economies from others at the international level. How this happens? This happens not through robbery, but through value transfers, meaning transfers of economic wealth from one group of economies to another. How this mechanism works? It works through three circuits. The first is through international trade, and there operates the law of absolute advantage, proposed by Adam Smith and Karl Marx. On the basis of absolute advantage, through international trade, what do you have? You have a transfer of value, of economic wealth, from less developed economies to more developed ones. There is a second circuit. This is through foreign direct investment, FDIs, meaning what? I'm a capitalist from a developed economy. I create a factory, an enterprise in a less developed economy. Why I do this? Because usually there I can find higher rates of surplus value, so higher profits, and on this basis I acquire higher profits. Now these profits, I can reinvest them in this economy, but also I can move them to my home country, the so-called home bias, or to other economies. So there is a transfer of value. And the third mechanism are international transfers of value through portfolio investment. Portfolio investment is investment in our international laws and positions in the international stock exchanges. In the cases of international laws, the case is obvious. If I'm country A and I give a loan to country B, then country B has to repay the loan, but also with interest. So there is a clear transfer of value. Similar mechanisms operate in the case of the stock exchange, the capital markets. Let me move to the last thing, which is how on the basis of the Marxist theory of imperialism, how we can understand what's happening nowadays. The name of the day is deglobalization and multipolarity. What actually is? These are also leitmotifs. I mean, widely used terms, and widely used terms are usually not very accurately and properly defined. let us try to dig behind that to have a more focused and more coherent understanding. First point, each capitalist superpower creates its economic superiority through protectionist means. This is typical. The historical evidence is tantamount to that. Britain became the first capitalist superpower through protectionism. The US, its successor, same thing. When a capitalist superpower acquires international economic supremacy, meaning becomes the more vibrant and developed economy, then it changes its cards. And whereas before it protected its economy, then it obliges everybody to open its economy. So free trade became the name of the day for British capitalism. Once British capitalism became the more developed capitalism in the 18th and 19th century, not before. Why? Because British capitalism was not afraid of competition from other capitalisms. Everybody else was afraid. Now, this is a very rosy picture to hold for too long. Why? Because if the Marxist analysis of the falling rate of profit is correct, a more developed capitalist economy is more prone to the problem of falling profitability. More developed capitalist economy means higher organic composition of capital. Higher organic composition of capital at some point would mean a falling rate of profit. Falling rate of profit means that what was before an economic superpower would be a weakling. So, more advanced capitalist economies are more prone to overaccumulation crisis, and the latter bite into the economic foundations of their supremacy. Now, the US is the capitalist superpower for almost 1 century, not a century yet. It became a superpower because of the dynamism of its economy in terms of technological development, productivity, competitiveness, and also because of its ascendancy over the international financial system, and especially the role of the dollar and as the main reserve currency. The same happened before that with Britain. Exactly the same. The US instigated the post-war globalization for the Western Bloc. That globalization was the Bretton Woods Agreement, the Bretton Woods system. It was a system that liberalized trade, capital movement within the Western Bloc. And this system worked from the end of the Second World War till the 1974 global crisis. The 1974 global crisis bite into the economic supremacy of the US very hardly. We know that it was hit very hardly, but it was able to surpass the problem. How? First, it scrapped the Bretton Woods Agreement, especially the linkage of the dollar to gold, the so-called quasi-gold standard. This facilitated, made more flexible the US monetary policy. The argument by Nixon's foreign minister, the dollar is our currency and your problem. So you have to go along with our wishes. And it was able, the US, to preserve its superpower position. How? Because it got into the argument with the agreement with Saudi Arabia and the rest, the oil trade to be denominated in dollar. And in this way, it obliged all the rest of the West to accept actually the dollar to remain the main reserve currency, although the dollar was not linked to gold anymore. In the 1985, the West supremacy was faltering again. This time there were challengers, especially Japan and the Far Eastern economies, and more shyly Europe. The European Union is making, back in that days and also nowadays, too much fun. We are the new superpower. Nothing near that. Japan was, Europe is a lame duck. What happened then? That was the Plaza Accord. The US marshaled both Japan and the then European Economic Community into subservience by obliging them to accept a depreciation of the dollar without the dollar losing its position as the international reserve currency. And second, by obliging all the others to buy US debt. For this reason, Japan, not China, is nowadays the main debtor of the US. And the European Union as a whole is an even bigger, not debtor, lender to the US. With what problems? The Plaza Accord had one consequence. What? The main challenger, Japan, was stuck in the mud. Japan, from the 1985 and onwards till today, is stuck in the mud. It is the Japanese economy is in stagnation for several reasons. I'll skip this. Now, the 1989 collapse of the Eastern Bloc gave new opportunities, but these were also short-lived for the reasons that I stated before. And then we came to the current situation. The current situation has a name, but not only a name. What is Trump? What? The first Trump administration. The usual liberal critics, the Democratic Party in the US, the Social Democratic parties in the European Union or elsewhere, say, oh, he's a nutcracker. He's a maverick. He doesn't know what he's doing. Okay, Trump may be a bit deranged, possibly, but the world capitalist superpower never has a deranged at its helm. Even if the guy has its own problems, and he might have several problems, there is a group behind him. And there is a dominant fraction of the US bourgeois class, or else he wouldn't be a president. So, moving behind superficial arguments, he's an idiot, he's a nutcracker, he's something like this. What is the Trump fraction of the US bourgeoisie trying to do? The main argument, and they have convinced the majority of the US bourgeoisie, is that, okay, globalization was a good game, but it has ended. So we can't go with this policy. We have to resort to more forceful politics. We are losing our status as an economic superpower, and it's a time for forceful measures, abrupt measures, not polite and subtle ones. That's the one point. The second point is that whereas the guiding principle before in the US bourgeoisie was mainly a remnant of the Cold War, the main challenger is the Soviet Union and then Russia and things like this. So pressurize Russia. with Trump administration, but also with Clinton. Clinton was the first, not Clinton, Obama. Obama was the first that pronounced the so-called pivot to Asia. The new challenger to US supremacy is not Europe, is not Russia, it's China. So we have to turn our focus there. Don't spend time with the rest. So that's the main argument, how it's being organized in terms of economic policy. Pay attention to the second bullet I'm arguing there. Those of you that might have followed development studies or international economics, although I don't think there are in the curricula, in the mainstream curricula nowadays, you might have heard about the Latin American structuralist school of import substituting industrialization. That was a radical school. The Sinker-Prebys thesis, for example, related to the dependency school as well, which argued that for the Latin American economies, meaning economies of a middle level of development, if they wanted to develop truly, they had to employ protectionist means, protect their internal economy and from foreign competition, and divert resources to industrialize. How? Through protection. So, import substituting industrialization, I protect my internal economy and I drive resources to industrialization, internal industrialization. Now, this strategy was confronted by the IMF, the World Bank, the US, the European Union, the whole West, as inefficient and things like this. What the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration also, the second Trump administration are doing, are actually such a policy. What they are trying to do is to reindustrialize the US economy and reindustrialize through protectionism. So tariffs came into the picture again, both in policy and then in theory. I skipped this, an explanation about the import substituting industrialization. How can we codify what the US are doing nowadays? In my opinion, two are the main guiding axes of this strategy. The first, reindustrialize the US economy, and the second, preserve the dollar's dominance on the international financial system. Why? Because the second is necessary in order to smoothly do the first. See, look what actually Trump is trying to do. He says, I'll put tariffs to your exports to the US. Unless you agree, I'll reduce the tariffs, but keep them. But you are obliged to do two things. First, invest in the US economy. And second, continue using dollar as the main reserve currency, and especially buying US debt. So these are the main pillars. Both of them are non-neoliberal pillars. They're very close to new Keynesian views about the economy. They are not neoliberal. The Trump administration and the Biden administration before it used industrial policy. Industrial policy is an anathema for neoliberalism. Gary Becker, the Nobel laureate, said, a prominent neoliberal, said, the best industrial policy is no industrial policy at all. And the US had always an industrial policy, but it says it overtly. So, there is another aspect regarding China. I'll skip this unless you want to ask about this. Now, the EU strategy is fraught with problems. Why? For the following three reasons. First, reindustrialization is a long-term process. You can't reindustrialize the industrialized economy at the snap of your fingers. It takes a long time for many reasons, because you have lost productive abilities, because your economy has to be restructured, and production is not an easy thing. It's not just playing with stock exchange and things like this. It's more hard and more time-consuming. Second, because retaining international financial supremacy is very difficult, because international trade and capital movements are increasingly fragmented, and also because nobody trusts the US, especially after its weaponization of the financial system through sanctions, tariffs, and unilateral moves. And third, because the US assumes unrealistically that all other countries will ultimately succumb to its will. Now, this happened with the teen prince, the European Union. The European Union very easily bends to the US demands, but it didn't happen with China, it didn't happen with India, and it didn't happen even with Brazil and several other big economies. So it's a very unrealistic expectation that I'll just throw a threat and everybody will conform. There you can see in this graph, and I'm finishing, that the decline of the US manufacturing, the hardcore of the US industry, is a long-term trend. It had actually began in the 1960s, and it's not an easily reversible trend. You can see it here in terms of labor productivity growth, which is a very important variable. I can explain this more if required. Here's the comparison of, not of the absolute level of labor productivity, but of the labor productivity rate of growth. And you see the difference with China, which is quite important. Retaining international financial supremacy is difficult for two interrelated reasons. The one is that central banks all over the world reduce their holdings of US dollar. Why? Because the share of US international trade is diminishing, and also because keeping US debt is becoming very dangerous. Back in the old days, having US debt was considered a safe investment. Nowadays, it is not. So for this reason, the international financial supremacy of the US is endangered. And the only thing that there is a bright spot for the US is that there is an increase of foreign direct investment inflows in the US economy. And this has started from the first Trump administration, and it continued with Biden and the second. But there is a caveat there. What's the caveat? The investment in the US economy are mainly investment by US multinationals that repatriate activities to their home country, or are mainly investment from the European Union, which is the easy target, not from the rest of the world. And that's the end of it. I hope I didn't exhaust you. There is a special problem also in the US strategy. I said before that the pivot to Asia is the guiding principle, meaning subjugating China. This is quite difficult. The US succeeded with the the European Union and Japan once. It's like a basketball team having devised a clever tactic to win a game. You can do it once, you can do it twice. To do it the third time, it's too much. Your opponent will read your play. And this is the case of China. Now, if I may dare to do a forecast, in my opinion, the US strategy won't succeed. And of course, its failure would lead to an end of the US supremacy. Of course, this can be very bloody because the US has shown that it's quite unscrupulous. It doesn't have a problem to push the button. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the very long and very, very detailed presentation. And now we're moving on to the Q&A. So if anybody has a question regarding any of that, just raise your hand and I will bring you a microphone into which you can speak that question. Questions? Okay.
Thank you. My question is regarding your last prediction, namely that the US strategy will bring forward the end of US global supremacy. Do you mean this primarily in an economic sense, in a financial sense, or in a military sense maybe? Because if we take into account the global military footprint of the US versus its rivals, namely China mostly, the US has a very big advantage in that department. In the military footprint, global military footprint, the US has a large advantage compared to China. And the Chinese internal market, especially financial market, is described as relatively shallow still compared with the US. Therefore, the Chinese renminbi is not that likely to become shortly global reserve currency, according to some economists. What do you think about this? How would this transition to a different hegemonic power would look like?
Well, very interesting question. Let me clarify a few things. The end of the US supremacy does not necessarily mean a Chinese supremacy. There, the term multipolarity, meaning a much more diverse world with different centers of more or less similar weight, is a possible scenario. That's the one thing. Second, although this might be deceiving, if we compare China and the US, China is closing the gap very fast, in many terms. I have some knowledge of the Chinese economy, both in technological terms. See the DeepSeek thing and the AI. Okay, the West is throwing the US. The European Union is a minion in this. Is throwing a lot of money in AI, in creating very expensive, energy-consuming servers and things like this. And the Chinese, with the DeepSeek, did the same and even better job with all the processors and much more cheaply at almost 10% of the cost. And that created a first problem in the so-called AI bubble. It might be at some next point a disaster. Okay, so let me try to codify my answer. A fall of the US supremacy does not necessarily imply a new superpower. It might lead to a more volatile environment, meaning several economies or blocks of economies of pretty similar weight struggling at an international level. Now, regarding two things, the argument about the financial sector, the argument about consumption regarding the Chinese economy. These are Western myths. The Chinese economy has problems, but not this. Not this. The consumption in the Chinese economy is increasing. The real wage is increasing. For us in the West, it's decreasing in the long term. But the Chinese model has an inherent emphasis on increasing production as opposed to consumption. Let me put it very simplistically. That was a clever choice. That was a clever choice. There was a stupid Western attack before COVID saying, come on, the Chinese growth rates are fictitious. Why? Because the Chinese collect national accounts, national statistical data in a different manner than in the West. Why? Because when you collect national accounts data, you do not measure every penny in the economy. Okay? You just make a sample measurement. Now, sample measurements are being made on the basis of hypotheses. The Western systems play a higher emphasis on the financial sector than on the productive sector. The Chinese system is different. When this stupid attack was pronounced, came out the Peterson Institute. Peterson Institute is an American institute, very conservative. And the head of its China desk said, don't say this, because if they used our system, their growth rate would be even higher. He was right. So there are several myths in the West that are totally unfounded. For example, there was the prediction that there would be a collapse of the housing market in China. Remember the 2008 crisis? What was the mainstream explanation? A stupid explanation, but till now it remains the mainstream explanation. How the crisis erupted? Because of the bad housing loans in the US. Okay. 1 year ago, we had the collapse of Evergrande in China, a huge construction company. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Why? Because the housing market operates differently in the Chinese economy than in the Western economy. Let me add another clarification there. A modern argument is that there would be a collapse of the housing market in China, and that would lead to a collapse of the Chinese economy. Why? Because the prices of houses are falling in China. Of course, if this happened in a Western economy, that would be a disaster. Why? Because banks would fail, and after the banks, the whole economy in the West would fail. But in China, this is a deliberate policy. They want to deflate the price of housing. And because the structure of the economy is different, I don't say that it's excellent, not necessarily a prototype, but the housing market works different. So in the West, you hear a lot of stupid things that are completely unfounded. And they are either myopic or simply propaganda. Okay, I could say also something about the financial sector, but
yeah, we have time for 2 more short questions, and then after that, okay, 1, 2 already taken both, and then after that you can come with us to Aurora, where we will have obviously Stavros as well, and then you can ask all the questions you want, so long as you remain legible from the amount of drinking. All right, first question. Let's keep it short and snappy.
Thank you for your presentation. My question would be, how would you analyze, according to your framework, whatever happened in Venezuela? Because as far as I know, ever since the Maduro government was supposedly overthrown, it was simply not overthrown. The government's still in place. And basically, everything that the US achieved was that they grabbed a couple of million of barrels of oil. However, when once again, as far as I know, if I'm not mistaken, when the government told these American oil companies to invest in Venezuelan oils, they simply stated that the Venezuelan oil infrastructure was basically non-existent and that it was not profitable to invest into Venezuela. And this is why this whole Venezuelan economic intervention by the US is stagnating. And I have no idea what to think about this. How would you analyze this whole thing with your framework? Thank you so much.
Just a few words, because this is a very complicated matter. Okay. Let me say this. With Chavez, there was a radical break in the Venezuelan economy and an attempt to redistribute wealth and reduce income inequalities. Part of that was the nationalization of the oil industry, which was actually in a piratic state before. The Americans plus a section of the Venezuelan bourgeoisie controlled the sector, right? Now, okay, Chavez nationalized the industry, but it failed afterwards. Regarding oil, for many reasons, especially because it couldn't change the technological infrastructure. It was mainly Western. There was an embargo, so Chavez could not change this. And this led, plus the embargo and the problems with Chevron and things like this in the US, that was the main Venezuelan outlet, led to actually to not collapse, but severe problems in the Venezuelan oil industry. Now, Venezuelan oil industry was the main breadwinner of the country. Okay. Now, the current situation is very complicated. We would not actually know what happened. There is the so-called fog of war, especially from the US side. From idiotic definitions, I run the country. Okay, it's not obvious this case. But also there are possibly problems within Venezuela itself. I mean, I don't know about a kinetic weapon or something, but for so many helicopters and airplanes to go, we can not even a rocket being fired at them, that's a problem. Something has happened. So it's a very complicated situation. We can explain, but till now the fog of war and the disinformation is too much. So I wouldn't dare to offer a more precise forecast.
So thank you, Professor. And maybe I would like to also appreciate you mentioning ISI, import substituting industrialization. And I think the interesting pattern for me was how the first Trump administration pushed it, and then the second, let's say, Biden administration also pushed it, which is the ISR. And that just showcases that this doesn't reflect ideology, but a whole society then approach. So my question comes, and I'll try to be as precise as possible. What are some other events that happened in the past 2-3 years that both the Trump and Biden administration both agreed on that could showcase where imperialism, or don't want to call it now US imperialism, but the US strategy is heading towards? And a short question, because my Greek friend here from Ceres wanted to ask. So he asked a very objective question, which is, whoever studies economics, why the hell don't they become Marxists in the end? Yeah, those are my questions.
Okay. Look, in my opinion, the idea of this pivot to Asia was simmering long before. I already said that Obama was the first that voiced it, but did not implement it. He worked still within the so-called framework of the rules-based world order. Exactly what Carney in his Davos talk demystified. So yeah, it was it, but it was never like this, but now it isn't. Okay, so this idea was simmering within the US ruling class. Okay, now with Trump, it became a dominant choice. The first Trump administration. It was partially followed by the Biden administration. The Biden administration, had this its look towards China, but its main thrust was against Russia. And the game that the US fraction is playing is let us get in a deal with Russia and focus on China. In the end of the day, that's their line of strategy. Biden didn't follow that. What he did, however, was a concerted effort to reindustrialize and preserve the international dominance of the dollar. So with Biden, we have an explicit industrial policy. Under new Keynesian economists and not planners, formulators of economic policy. Then with the second Trump administration, the pivot to Asia is much more pronounced, although they are afraid of a direct conflict, so they are going around. But it's obvious the focus on Asia and the attempt to strike a deal with Putin. Okay, and then we have an even more pronounced use of industrial policy, even in theoretical terms. I don't remember the name of the guy who is the chair of Trump's economic advisors. He's being touted as a replacement for the Fed chairman, but possibly not. He has written a book on industrial policy, very forceful, totally anti-liberal, and of course, totally conservative and reactionary. The one goes, this can go together. So there was some continuity with Biden, but the second Trump administration is much more forceful regarding its main strategy. Now, regarding the last thing about Marxism, Marxism lives in the underworld. Yes, in a mainstream economics department, like my old department, it's almost back in Greece, is practically illegitimate, to say the least, to say it politely, proscribed. Yes, there is an increased interest, especially by young people, and this is hopeful, but it still requires a lot of work to be done. To say the least.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. If you have any further questions, you can of course approach Stavros now, or you can come with us to Aurora, where there will be a little bit more looser of an atmosphere, maybe some opportunity for debating if that is necessary, and then definitely some exchange of ideas.